Hi, my name is William Seymour and I'm going to be presenting our talk today, Is It Time Our Devices Show a Little Respect? Informing the Design of Respectful Intelligent Systems. This is work that I completed at the University of Oxford as part of my PhD, and I'm now at King's College, London. So the first question you probably have is, what is respect? Respect, as a word that we use in everyday life, has a lot of different meanings packed into it. And we normally rely on the context and other subtle clues to tell us which is being talked about at any given situation. As something that's integral to the way that we talk and interact with each other all the time, respect often forms an intuitive part of our lives, and this can make it difficult to unpick and explain. But at the same time, it's a really important word to be able to make use of when we're designing and developing systems, because it covers a lot of things that otherwise fall through the cracks when we use kind of alternative existing ways of thinking about ethical problems in design. So to start us off, we've kind of got four intuitive ways of thinking about respect here. So we might respect a directive, a law, or other sort of request, like the speed limit when you're driving. You might respect somebody's privacy, either through a kind of explicit directive like do not track, or through legal instruments like the GDPR in Europe or the CCPA in the US. You might also respect something as an obstacle, so think a sailor's respect for the sea, something that could harm us or work against our goals in some way if we don't take proper consideration of it. We might respect somebody's skill, something that they've arrived at through hard work and dedication, like plastering or painting. And we might also respect institutions, be they social, cultural, or historical, like the office of a president, or you might show respect to a judge in the legal system by standing as they walk into a courtroom. But there are other questions that come up when we start thinking about respect like this and decomposing it into different types of respect. Is respect something that's due to everyone? Well, maybe, but also respect is something that's earned, right? As the skill example previously. It's certainly a key component of human relationship, society, and culture, and kind of forms a key part of our lives in that sense. And then when we're thinking as designers, if respect is something that we are obligated to do for each other and other people that we meet, is it also an obligation that we have to our users and the people who use the systems that we create? I'm going to start off by looking at different conceptualizations of respect, thinking about what respect is, what it means, how we do it, and how we show it. And in doing so, I'm going to relate this to intelligent systems to highlight how different understandings of respect might manifest when we create digital technology, particularly in relation to data and privacy. A great starting point here is the work of Immanuel Kant. Kant was a major historical figure in the philosophy of respect. His work has been hugely influential and can be seen in many of the theories that have followed. Kant's major thesis here was that we should respect the worth of other people as human beings, as moral agents and people with moral capacity. And this forms the basis for the human rights as we understand them today. So you can see here, one should always treat humanity, whether in oneself or in another, always as an end and never merely as a means. And this language of means and ends is a useful tool to start unpicking the systems that we see around us, and think about whether they treat people as means or whether they're ends in themselves. Respect, as Kant saw it, imposes a moral obligation on people to treat others in such a way that we uphold this categorical imperative. When we're relating this to data and privacy, obviously we want to think about treating users and their needs genuinely. A great example here is dark patterns and nudging behaviors where systems are trying to convince people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise agree to. And we can also see distinctions start to arise between other principles that we use when designing. So fairness is a good example here. You can probably already start to imagine a system that fairly allocates resources across the population, but does so in a way that's disrespectful to the people involved. More generally, when we're using classifiers and similar systems, we're also prioritizing the end of a fair distribution according to whatever metric we're using, over the individual decisions that are being made about people. So we can start asking ourselves, do these features that we see treat people's needs as ends in themselves? And is it possible that the system that I'm looking at is fair, accessible, but simultaneously disrespectful? Kantian ethics is a great starting point for thinking about respect in the context of digital systems. But since then, a lot of criticisms have been leveled, particularly at the abstract nature of the way that Kant conceptualized respect. By rooting respect and the obligation to respect others in our moral capacity, Kant creates this sort of genderless, colorless political subject. Everybody is due respect in the same way because, in terms of moral capacity, we're all equal. Obviously, this doesn't really hold up to the world that we find ourselves in, and the kind of structural oppression that pervades society means that we need to rethink our approach to respect. To this end, people have integrated ideas from feminist care ethics into conceptualizations of respect, focusing on the characteristics and the relationships that make us all unique, and focusing on nourishing those and allowing people to flourish and kind of caring for their well-being. Others, such as Charles Mills, have tried to reform Kantian ethics in a way that reflects the marginalization of groups in society and sort of redresses the balance in terms of what Kant originally envisaged. When we're thinking again about comparing respect to existing things like fairness, and kind of note that whereas fairness typically focuses on notions of like distributive justice, so allocating resources and welfare across a population, respect really highlights the importance of justice as recognition or as representation in the way that we portray and the way that we interact with different groups. Applying this to data and privacy, a clear example of this is any system that has a model of relationships or bodies, thinking about families that transcend homes, transcend countries, cause problems with a lot of software, menstruation trackers that are designed for premenopausal cis women, and other general kind of paternalistic interventions made by software. If you've ever had an inopportune Windows update, you know what I mean. Updates are good and you will have one now. For classifiers, really any act of reducing people to a small set of features in order to make decisions about them goes against this notion of respect. So we really want to examine the objective functions that we use when we create software. For a social network, perhaps instead of optimizing for engagement time, we might optimize for like the protection of or engagement with the vulnerable. And also thinking about how systems might interact with existing inequalities. And even though they're not explicitly related, the kind of knock-on effects that decisions made by a system might have, or the differences in starting points when people come to a system. Something that the previous conceptualizations of respect have had in common is that they assume that respect exists outside of humans and human society. But another way of looking at respect is as an enacted and dynamic concept, something that arises through our actions and interactions with each other and the social rules and social norms that we set in our cultures and societies. A good example of this is the way that we can ascribe or not agency to other people. So if you're talking with somebody who doesn't share a first language with you and they say something that could be perceived as an insult, you might choose to attribute that to a cultural mishap and not the speaker's agency. Or you might choose to do so and take it as the insult that it could be. Similarly, if you give up your seat to somebody on public transport, an action that might be intended as a show of respect could be perceived as saying that the person needs help and removes their ability, their agency to choose to ask for help. And in this way, respect as an enacted concept is sort of bound up with self-identity and self-expression. Similarly, Goffman talks about the way that we give out social signals and use social structures to tell other people how we are to be treated, and through deference and social rituals, we perform those behaviors to other people as a way of showing respect. Applying this to data and privacy, accessibility is a key area, It's very easy, and there's a great risk of conflating needing help with wanting help when designing accessibility features, particularly those that deploy themselves or suggest their own deployment, and also in the way that they are labeled and demonstrated to users. There's also the performance of gender and other human characteristics by chatbots and voice assistants, and the way that this impacts not only on the people who are using the system, but also on the groups who share characteristics that the system is performing. And more broadly, it's important to allow people the freedom and the room to express themselves and self-identify. We can look at systems and ask what the flows, the structure, and the architecture of the system assume about the user, often implicitly, and particularly when these systems fail or encounter unintended input or behavior, what effect does this have on interactions and the groups that share characteristics? I'm going to move on now to the configurations of respect that arise when we're looking at systems in the wild, and we can think about different boundaries between people and parts of the system and look at how respect affects those boundaries particularly. So these complex ecologies arise because systems aren't monolithic. They've got lots of interlocking parts that work together, vast design and development teams, people who use them, and then also people who are affected by them in their normal usage. So as an example, we can ask the question of Alexa whether it's sexist, but really this question involves looking at 4 different configurations of respect that might arise. So you've got the interactions between the user and the device, how the user feels respected or not by what Alexa says to them, what it offers them, and how it responds to them. But there's also the way that the designers and the developers of Alexa show respect to the user through the way that Alexa is designed and the way that Alexa is supposed to communicate with them. The development of Alexa's voice and conversation routines are closely bound with the communities who share the characteristics that Alexa is performing, and also the way that Amazon presents Alexa as a device for the home, as an assistant, and the way that interacts with existing roles, perceptions, and biases in society. So we can think about the way that devices respect users, and potentially users show respect, deference to devices, as well as how designers communicate that respect to users via devices. But also the way that devices allow users to show respect or not to each other. We can similarly ask for systems that facilitate or mediate communication between people. Do they promote respect between those users of the system? For a smart home device, this might be members of a household. For online platforms, this could be an audience. But maybe on forums, social networks, you've also got strangers and friends. And as an example of this, if we think about automated email responses, where Gmail or Outlook will suggest how you can respond to somebody. So the system or its designer, it sort of is respecting your time by taking the hard work out of responding in a predictable kind of boilerplate way, allowing you to show deference, but at the same time offering a small selection or one choice in how to respond undermines your personal autonomy by limiting your space to kind of construct a personalized response to the recipient. But on the other hand, it allows you to show respect for other people by responding to them quickly and attentively, and kind of following the social rules that are expected. The very fact that these sort of smart compose features exist frame the task of replying to somebody as a burden or an obstacle, rather than an opportunity to respond personally to the other person and to kind of consider their needs. So there are all of these different aspects of respect that come into play through what feels like a very simple, mundane system. And finally, I want to spend a bit of time talking about how respect applies particularly to different parts of the life cycle of intelligent systems. When creating new systems, we might think about how different approaches, paradigms, and architectures upfront change the ways that we can show respect to people that use our systems, and maybe constrain the ways that we have to treat them and the ways that they have to interact with each other. Kind of really questioning whether these choices frame the people affected by a system as means or ends. So that just the very use of a classifier, right, changes the calculus as to how you approach this kind of a task and how respect applies to the ensuing system. And asking, related to this, what parts of the user experience are being optimized for, how they consider people, their individuality, their ability to express themselves, the extent to which they're ascribed agency, all of these things that we've just been talking about. And finally, kind of bearing in mind what Derrida calls the colonial impulse of ubiquitous computing. Just because something can be categorized, recorded, analyzed, doesn't necessarily mean that this is the ethical thing to do. So thinking about the boundary where people interact with algorithms, representation on design teams is a massive first step to preventing some of these problems. Reminiscent of the nothing about us without us, in a lot of cases where deeply disrespectful products have been created, it's clear that a representative design team would not have made the same mistakes. And we see in online content moderation how seemingly small or contained decisions can lead to the reproduction and enforcement of these sexist or racist assemblages that we see in other aspects of society. Finally, when it comes time to sunset a system, respect can help us to look through the decisions that are made there. The preservation of communities, working with and including the people who have integrated the system into their everyday lives is very important. Yahoo Answers is a good example, where there's this struggle suddenly to capture what's seen as a cultural heritage from users, whereas for Yahoo maybe it's more of a just a product that's going away. And this idea of understanding the role that systems come to play in people's everyday activities and the relationships that they have with other people and other systems is illustrated quite well by Jibo, which was a social robot for the home. People interacted with Jibo over the course of weeks or months, and then one day the company that manufactured it decided to turn off the servers, so Jibo did one last dance for people, and then for all intents and purposes died, which is is an insensitive way of ending a relationship that was started by exploiting these aspects of respect and social rules, and we can use respect at both ends of this equation to kind of see how it plays out and how it could be done differently. So now, to wrap up, I've discussed several different ways of conceptualizing and thinking about respect, what it is and how we might show it to the people who use the systems that we create, as well as how this relates to their implementation, data, and privacy. And now I just want to leave you with a couple of questions to think about in relation to the systems that you use on a day-to-day basis that will hopefully spur some interesting discussion. So the first of these is, what does respect mean for your users and the communities that you interact with in a commercial or an academic setting? What's important to them, given what we've talked about today? How might respect manifest in their interactions with the system? Secondly, does the system treat people as ends in themselves, or are they merely a means to solve another problem that they just happen to be related to? Finally, what implicit assumptions underpin the design decisions and the architecture of the system? And perhaps most importantly, what other ways might there be of achieving the same goals without needing to rely on those assumptions? So thank you very much for watching. This is the end of the talk, and I think it's now time for questions. Please feel free to follow up by email. I'm at KCL now. My email address is listed here. Thanks again.